evening. Hi. I'm Ted Hadzi-Antich. I teach in the government department and also one of the instigators of the Great Questions seminars. Thank you for being here for the Fall 2019 Great Questions lecture. In this semi-annual lecture series, we invite scholars from outside of our community to discuss the works of the authors whom we read in Humanities 1301 Great Questions seminar. In this seminar, students explore the works of authors like Homer, Plato, Sappho, and Rumi in a welcoming, discussion-based classroom led by dedicated faculty members who are passionate about their success. I encourage you to explore more about our program, although I expect that most of you are already in it, but if not, there's information outside and also on our website. This lecture is a little bit unique in that we'll begin with a traditional talk followed by a question and answer period, but then we're going to form a big circle and have a conversation. And our conversation will go wherever it goes and it will end when it feels right. So it'll be very much in the spirit of a Great Questions seminar. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to thank the Teagle Foundation, whose support helps grow our Great Questions project at Austin Community College, and which made Dr. Keshavarz' visit to ACC possible. I'd like to thank our college administration in supporting the liberal arts at Community College, particularly our deans, Dr. Dowdy Laurent, Dean of Liberal Arts, Humanities, Communication, and Dr. Escavera Cruz, the Dean of Liberal Arts, Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'd like to recognize our growing cohort of 55 trained Great Questions faculty members, and in particular Dr. Grant Potts, Professor Carrie Pope, and Dr. Jean Laura, whose support and continued collaboration make the Great Questions at ACC possible. Finally, I'd like to thank our Great Questions student assistant, Ms. Lauren Stone, who, with other Great Questions students, helped organize the event for this evening. Please join me in supporting these individuals' dedication to the growth of liberal arts at Austin Community College. The focus this evening will be on the 13th century Persian scholar, theologian, and mystic poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, whose verse continues to inspire people across multiple religious traditions. I am delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz, who holds the Roshan Chair in Persian Studies and directs the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Keshavarz is a published poet and author of many books, including the acclaimed Reading More Than Lolita in Tehran. She is the host of Radio Rumi, a bi-weekly podcast dedicated to the work of the poet about whom we are here today to learn more. Join me in welcoming Dr. Keshavarz to ACC for the Fall 2019 Great Questions lecture, Rumi, a Poet for the 21st Century.
Good evening. Can you hear me well? Good. Well, thank you all for coming out to listen to me, and special thanks to Great Questions, and in particular, Professor Hadzi-Antich, who has been in touch with me, and we have basically worked to plan this presentation and hopefully make it exciting and stimulating to you all. The poet Rumi, the poet about whom I will speak tonight, once said, if you are lost in the desert, you look up at the stars to find your way. And people did this very often. If they were just lost, they would look at the stars and they would decide they are south, north, east, west, and find their way. So he said, if you're lost in the desert, you look up at the stars to find your way. Does a star ever speak to you? So we'll come back to this to see what he means, and why is it that I think this is an indication of why he is such a desired teacher for our times, even though he lived many, many centuries ago. In fact, we celebrated his 813th birthday last September. So if you like to eat that cake, you can come there in September, on September 17, University of Maryland. We have a special cake for him. And we do talks and things like that on that particular evening. So, but first things first, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Persian literature. And then I'm going to move on to saying a little bit about Rumi's life and time, just so that we can situate him in the situation, the life condition in which he lived. And then I'll take you back to this point that I started with, and basically we will explore why, from my perspective, he continues to be a best-selling poet in translation in the United States and in many other places in the world, actually. So, when you say Persian poetry and Persian literature, but particularly poetry, most of the time people think about something like miniature painting, something very delicate, very complex, but remote, and somehow not possible to really do anything besides admiring its beauty, not connecting with it in a one-on-one basis, day-to-day life. You would be surprised to know that a lot of Iranian intellectuals, not the general readers, I'm going to come back to that, said things about Persian poetry and Persian literature of pre-modern period in the same vein in the 20th century in particular. They thought that this was something highly stylized art that was basically caught in a web of tradition that prevented it from doing anything lively and relevant to life. And even later on, I mean, in the 20th century, when many countries in the Middle East begin to compare themselves with Western countries that seem to be moving forward with industrialization and in all kinds of results of enlightenment and industrialization, they begin to blame that poetry and say, well, maybe we are too caught in our literary tradition and keep just reading about wine and love and, you know, roses and nightingales and these images that come from Persian traditional poetry. In fact, there is a line by a great poet, Hafiz, who said, "Beneshin bar lab ju yo gozar omr bebin." I'm going to quote from time to time a little original poetry in Persian for you to hear the music of it. So that line means, sit at the edge of a stream and watch the passing of your life. This became kind of a motto for modernists, saying, well, we sat on the edge of the stream and enjoyed the flow of our lives, and the world got ahead of us, and they did all these wonderful things in, you know, scientific progress and things like that. Well, like any extreme idea, there's a lot of exaggeration there. But tonight, I want to tell you that views are changing, fortunately. Views are changing on that. And I want to tell you that Persian poetry, and I can actually say that about most Middle Eastern poetry, particularly I have in mind Turkish and Arabic, is far from this kind of motionless, exotic, you know, decorative object that you put on the mantelpiece and on the mantle, and you enjoy the beauty of it. In the hands of poets like Sa'di, Hafiz, and Rumi, about whom we will talk tonight, this poetry turned into a lot of things, like a creative mode of engaging life's daily challenges. It turned into a kind of dynamic and down-to-earth way of looking at life. What one of the critics describes as an imaginative struggle with language. So as they made that struggle with language, how to say it better, they also struggled with life, with change, and with questions that need addressing, great questions that you yourselves deal with in this particular part of your study. what were some of these great questions for Rumi? For example, one of them was listening to your own inner voice. That's a theme that comes out of his poetry all the time, that we are so taken by the daily strife and what we have to pull together so that our daily life passes, that we forget to listen to our own inner voices. And that this voice, upon some real creative struggle with life, could get deeper and deeper and get infused with meaning in such a way that we could find our way through many problems in life. And I will give you reasons towards the end of this presentation, which I'm hoping will not be longer than 40, 45 minutes, why these questions now are so central to our lives. Now, as for Rumi himself, he was born in 1207, actually not in Balkh, as many people think. Sometimes he's called Balkhi, but he actually was born in a small city called Vakhsh, outside a river known as Vakhshab, in the country which is today Afghanistan. Now, many Iranians and Afghans and Turks and others have been saying, no, he's Turkish, he grew up in Turkey after his family immigrated there, and Iranians saying, he was born in Khorasan, he spoke Persian, and Afghans saying, excuse me, Vakhshab was in Afghanistan. But interestingly enough, he kept saying, I don't belong to the East or the West. I don't have a country. And in doing so, he wanted to belong to a bigger expanse, inner and outer, that all human beings had a way of accessing. When he was probably around the age of 9 or 10, there were serious wars going on from Central Asia, when the Mongols of Central Asia were moving westwards and coming forward to invade countries on their way. His father, Rumi's father, who was a very distinguished and respected theologian, at that point decided to leave town. Now, we don't know if he left town because some other theologians living around him were not as ready to be revolutionary and come up with ideas and interpretations that were not really acceptable to them, or was it the fear of that war, or was a combination of many things? But whatever was the reason, the family got together and moved westwards and went through many large cities until they finally settled in what is known as Konya or Konya in present-day Turkey. And that is where Rumi grew up. Now, it's interesting that that city at the time was a cosmopolitan city. It had Persian speakers, Arab speakers, and Turkish speakers. It had Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And it was a city that you could find a layer of highly educated elite in it. You could find very ordinary people who just went about doing their everyday life, and you could find people who only spoke Turkish and didn't follow either Persian literature or the Arabic text, which belonged to their religion. Now, sometime around the age of 40, this older man by the name of Shams walked into the town, and there are lots of stories about what happened, but there was an encounter between Rumi and him. Now, Rumi was around about 25 years old. He was very respected by the community. His father had died. He was 25 when his father had died, but at this point he was more closer to 40. But ever since that time of the passing of his father. He had been the main lecturer in the university in town, was highly respected, wore the, the long, loose robe that scholars wore, and taught in that university every day. After meeting with this person, suddenly everything changed. He stopped teaching. He started wearing a different kind of very simple black outfit. And one day, as he was passing through the market, he got to where the goldsmiths work. Now, if any of you have been to the Middle East and you've been to blacksmiths or goldsmiths quarter, you know that artists work with little hammers and chisels on pieces, and they create a very melodic combination of sounds in the bazaar, which gives a great echo to it. So as he reached in front of one of these gold stores, he started whirling for the first time. Now, have you ever seen an image of whirling or, or heard about it? They're known as whirling dervishes, people who just whirl for hours. Now, we can talk in the conversation that we will have afterwards about what that might mean and, all kinds of interpretations of it. They hold one hand up to the heavens and one down to the earth, which could mean connecting the heaven and the earth. Or you might say they never thought that the heaven and the earth were separate, so that might mean something else. But they did that. And that was, for the first time, Rumi started doing that just out of the blue. The whole market came to standstill. People came and watched. According to some sources, he went on for about an hour. Now, people who train to do whirling have to work to learn it. It's not that easy to do that. And they teach you how you need to look at the palm of your hand so you don't get dizzy. And, I haven't done it, but I've just seen people training. So it's very interesting to know exactly how long he turned, but that became a tradition that he and his groups did till the end of his life. And these were gatherings where you could have 10, 15, 20 people just whirling. And people of different religions came in. Women came in sometimes, because we know sometimes they were criticized for bringing everything together in their whirling. Now, who was Shams is very interesting. He was a highly outspoken basket weaver who traveled from town to town and stayed in a place, and sometimes he put a lock on the door so that people thought he wasn't home, not to basically bother him. And sometimes he came in the marketplace or someplace and talked, and he said things in which people in high places were highly offended. So he was a very, very strange person and stayed strange till the end. In fact, Rumi says, "Khod qaribi dar jahan chun Shams nist." There is nobody as strange as Shams. And he says about himself, "An yar segune khat neveshti," that beloved, probably God, wrote 3 kinds of scripts. Yeki ra hamu khandi ba ham ghayro. There was one script that he could read, God, and everybody else could read too. Yeki ra u khandi ba la ghayr. There was one that he could read. Now, he's the writer, remember. He could read, but nobody else could. And there was a 3rd script that he wrote that neither he could read nor anybody else. An khatta sevom mana. I am that 3rd script. And he became known as Khatta Sevom. In fact, there is a book about him in Persian called The 3rd Script. Now, I thought about this for a long time because he wasn't an unreasonable person. And Sufis who were mystic thinkers within the Islamic tradition, and basically, if we want to define them very, very briefly, they believed that human beings are capable of having direct connection with God, and they don't need anybody else to do that for them. The humanity in them allows them to do so. And then they had often highly unconventional interpretations of religion. So the Sufis did say shocking things. And they did it on purpose. They wanted people to stop and say, well, what are you talking about? And begin to think. Because if we're not shocked, very often we could go on with life as if, you know, it's just habitual things and not thinking about things. So at first you might think that Shams said that just to shock people. But then as I thought more and more about it, I thought, no, he probably meant I'm a script that is being rewritten every instant. And when you analyze his life and his writing and his thinking, that's exactly what he says. Every moment you have to be born out of whatever you were in into a new state of being, which is quite difficult to do, but at the same time, you know, you can have that as the goal of your life. I'm not going to stay the same person. I'm going to be exploring to be who I can become. Okay, now that he had a great impact on Rumi's life. As I said, he started whirling, he gave up teaching, he had written poetry before too, but he really got writing beautiful and large amounts of ecstatic poetry that showed his inner turmoil in some ways. And a lot of them were about change. So that is again connected with that concept that Shams introduced of the third script. I'm going to read one to you. مرده بودم زنده شدم گریه بودم خنده شدم دولت عشق آمد و من دولت پاینده شدم دیده سیر است مرا جان دلیر است مرا زهره شیر است مرا زهره تابنده شدم. I want you to pay attention to the music and the inner rhymes. It's not just that at the end you get پاینده شدم تابنده شدم, but in the middle you get chunks that again rhyming with each other. So bring a rhythm. گفت که دیوانه نی لایق این خانه نی رفتم و دیوانه شدم سلسله بندنده شدم گفت که تو مست نی رو که از این دست نی رفتم و سرمست شدم و از طرب آکنده شدم I was dead, I came to life. I was a cry, I turned into laughter. The fortune of love fell upon me, and I turned into everlasting fortune myself. I no longer crave things. My soul is brave, brave as a lion and bright like a star. He said, now this he could be a beloved, it could be God, it could be a close friend. He said, you're not crazy enough. You do not deserve to live in this house. I became crazy. I put myself in chains. He said, you're not drunk enough. Give up this pretense. You're not the right type. I became drunken. I became full of enchantment. So that basically, in a way, is Rumi's life story. After meeting with Shams, he kept going through different stages of rediscovering himself and speaking about it in this melodic language that became very popular in his own lifetime, and very often it was sang as they whirled to music. Now, some things about Rumi that are not probably totally common to all figures as, you know, great thinkers or figures. One is that when he died, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all honoring him in their own tradition. So in a way, each one, I mean, they knew he was a Muslim, but in a way, each one of them felt that he belonged to them too. So this kind of multi-religious pull is not very common for a time when the the wars are going on, what's Shanghai Salibi, the Muslim Christian wars, the famous Crusades, thank you. The Crusades were going on and all that. And in his world, there was no point in fighting because there was a lot more in common than was not. So that was one thing. The other one was that he has kind of appropriated certain things to himself completely without having any power to enforce it, just through his presence. One is that in Persian, if you say Maulana, which means our master, it only means Rumi. So you say Maulana, everybody will understand that you're talking about him. If you say Masnavi, which is a poetic form, it's a rhyming couplet, everyone understands to be his Masnavi, a book he wrote in 27,000 verses in the last 4 years of his life to explain to people what he meant by life being a journey in which we have to become new and renewed every moment of our lives. The Masnavi became known as the Quran in Persian language. And that was by people, even people who, of course, honored the Quran as their script and major scripture, but they still saw Rumi as having produced something which was an embodiment of that text. So, and also if you say divan, which means a collection of poems, everybody in Persian would understand you to mean the collection of lyric poems by Rumi. So he has kind of appropriated these without having ever to ask for it. Now, we are at the point now to start thinking about now. And some things that people immediately begin to think after they hear these things about Rumi was he an exceptional figure among Persian poets? Do you think he was? No. There are tons of others. They all have each their colors, their own writing style, sometimes in some ways less energetic and less unconventional, in some other ways different. But in a way, he came out of this tradition that had matured by this time and could produce thinkers, poets who had the courage to be the way he was. And another question is, did a lot of people object to what he's saying? I mean, I've been on interviews and things like that, and people say, does the Iranian government allow people in Iran to read Rumi? He's in every possible house, and he's a best-selling author. I mean, he's just flowing in the veins of the culture, if you like, and he did all the way through. And probably the reason for it is that he understood this culture, this tradition so well, that instead of fighting it like this, he absorbed it, he understood it, he loved it, and then he tried to renew it. He tried to give it a new way of expression, a new way of understanding, which is part of the reason why I think it is so important for our times to be able to do that kind of thing. Okay, let me just say that not really as a point of putting down my tradition or my English academic background, but English-speaking scholars and critics were the last people who discovered him. Like, I mean, he was in the Arab world, in the Turkish-speaking world, in Germany, in France, in everywhere, and then step by step, people in the 70s and 80s started discovering him, and then, of course, people like Coleman Barks came around and created these translations, which in some ways are very good, in some ways not so good because they don't show all of the picture or and so on, but kind of brought him to people. And just one last point about him. So he wrote the book the Masnavi, which is 27,000 verses, describing his mystical tradition and what people needed to think about and do, and he never wanted people to imitate him, to take and make it their own and do it their own way. The other one was the collection of his lyric poems that just came out, just really flew, and like a spring out of the earth, something, on an amazing amount. Like, he should have been writing, he must have been writing about 2 or 3 poems a day for all of this to be written. And then we also have a collection from him, which is about his conversations with ordinary people who sat around him, and that is very fun to read, because in those he is more humorous and less complicated, and communicates with you. Okay, now to the reasons that make him a poet for our time. And these are my perceptions, and I'm going to just list them and say a little bit about each of them. I think that one of the first things about him is that he does not understand knowledge to mean certainty. He does not want people to just take what he says because for his word for what he says. And in fact, he believes, as we believe now, that all knowledge is partial and is perspectival. No knowledge is ever complete. We never know totally everything about whatever it is that we want to know. We have to always accept that somebody else can look at it from a different perspective, and it's in that sense that it's perspectival. Okay. He's very comfortable with that. There's a story of elephant. Do you know the story of the elephant? Okay. So there's people who have never seen an elephant hear that there's an elephant in town, and they're really curious about to see what the elephant looks like. So they run to this. Actually, the elephant is brought by an Indian from India. So he took the story from India, actually. So people run to the house of this elephant owner and say, we want to see the elephant. We've never seen an elephant. And he says, guys, it's dark. It's night. Come back tomorrow. They say, no, the time is short. Maybe we won't be alive tomorrow. Maybe the elephant will be taken. We want to see it now. He says, okay, fine, go in there. So they go in there. There's a dark room, and they have to only touch the elephant. So they touch the elephant and come out. The next day, those who hadn't gone in say to those who had, what does an elephant look like? The one who has touched the leg of the elephant says, well, an elephant looks like a big, thick column. And the one who has touched the ear of the elephant says, oh, no, the elephant is like a big fan. And the one who has touched, who's been taller and touched the upper part of the back of the elephant or around that area, he says, no, you're all wrong. The elephants look like a throne, a place you can sit on. And at this point, Rumi says, در کف هر یک اگر شمعی بودی اختلاف از گفتشان بیرون شدی. If they were each carrying a candle, they will be all looking at the same beast. And so that is how he views knowledge. We are touching an elephant in the dark and trying to make out this huge shape, and of course we can't. And each one of us has a piece of the description. Another is about our inability to communicate with each other. Oh, how we need to learn that now. And again, he gives us a story, this story of grapes. There are 4 people, an Arab, a Turk, a Greek, and a Persian. And they don't have money, and they just, somebody gives them a few dirhams, which are the money, a few dollars, and says, go get yourself what you like. So the Arab says, oh, great, let's go get some inab. And the Turk says, no, no, I want üzüm. The Greek says, actually, I feel like some estafil today. And the Persian says, you're all wrong. Let's go get some angur, and then you would know what a great fruit that is. And what they don't know is that all these words in their own language mean grape, grapes. So at this point, Rumi says, if there was a person there who spoke these languages, they would have not been getting into this fight. Now, I don't want to oversimplify the conflicts of the world and say, well, if only we spoke each other's language, we would now be at peace. But a lot more reasonable ways of thinking about our problems, a lot more collaborative and respectful ways of doing things could have developed that could address some of our problems. And the thing is, it's not even about language, even though he uses language, because somewhere else he says, همزبانی خویشی و پیوندی است، مرد با نامحرمان چون بندی است، ای بسا هندو و ترک همزبان، ای بسا دو ترک چون بیگانگان. He says, to speak the same language is to share the same blood, to be related. Now you think he's talking about blood in the sense of racial connection? And then he says, to live with strangers is a life of captivity. And then he says, many are Hindus and Turks who share the same language. Many are Turks who are alien to one another. The language of companionship is a unique one. To reach someone through the heart is other than reaching them through words. Besides words, allusions, and arguments, the heart knows 100 ways to speak. So I would say that this is another characteristic of Rumi that is of great interest to us, and people in the world are kind of discovering this. Yeah, there was somebody who lived in the 13th century and was so open to other traditions. And despite all of this philosophical, deep looking at everything, including our human existence, he also sees ourselves as not separated to body and soul. And this is a very controversial thing to say about a medieval thinker. There are so many people who think we are base as in our bodies, in the desires we have for food, for sex, for attention, for being beautiful. It's all base. And then there is this exalted part of our being, which is our soul. And he constantly uses a combination of these imagery to tell us that we are both these things together, and neither is complete without the other. And I think that is something that we really want to hear, because we've been compartmentalized in many traditions for a long time. So listen to this. هر که ز حور پرسدت رخ بنما که همچنین. هر که ز ماه پرسدت بام برآ که همچنین. هر که پری طلب کند چهره خود بدو نما. هر که ز مشک پرسدت زلف گشا که همچنین. هر که بپرسدت ز مه ابر چگونه وا شود باز گشا گره گره بند قبا که همچنین. If anyone asks you about Huris, now Huris were these beautiful beings in paradise, both male and female, but Huris are the female version. If anyone asks you about the Huris, show your face, say like this. If anyone asks you about the moon, climb up on the roof, say like this. If anyone seeks a fairy, let them see your countenance. If anyone talks about the aroma of musk, untie your hair, say like this. Now, you might think, okay, this is all very distant, the moon up there, you know, Rumi down here. Oh. If anyone asks, how do the clouds uncover the moon? Untie the front of your robe, knot by knot, say like this. If anyone asks, how did Jesus raise the dead? Kiss me on the lips, say like this. And this sensual beauty is appreciated for its own sake. Now, I don't intend to say that he was, you know, totally no rules or regulations, no disciplines, all of those were in place. As a human being, you had to be very respectful of your own physical existence as you were of other people's physical existence. Commitment was important. All of these things are in there. But the physical beauty is appreciated for its own value, for its own beauty, because beauty is one way of getting our attention, getting us to think about things that we may not otherwise dare to think about. Now, we move through this poem. When we get to the end, he says, to blind with envy the one who says, how can a human being reach God? Give us each a candle of purity, say like this. So is he talking to God? Was he talking to the physical beloved? Are these two separate? All of these things are really little puzzles for us to solve. He's never going to come up with a solution and say, well, and the right answer to this is X, Y, or Z, because you will get the solution and you stop searching. Whereas in fact, he wants you to whirl, you know, and not start at one point and end in the other. Now, the other thing that's very attractive to our times is that he is not punitive. He's not about, he's actually very adamantly against judging other people, about setting up a process of saying, oh, you're wrong, you have to, you know, pay for this by being isolated or by being fined or by being whatever. It's a system, a process of being allowed to make mistakes within limits. Obviously, you can't go, you know, kill someone or do something terrible like that, but be a human being with all his or her flaws of an individual and find your way forward. The other thing is, he comes very close to animals, to nature, and to things that prior to him are not necessarily suitable to be in all of this very highly respected high art of poetry. And one time he says, as he's talking to the people around him, he says, well, I am going to say these things. I just can't keep them inside anymore, and I hope you enjoy them and take them with you and do things with them. I'm like this pregnant woman whose breasts are so filled with milk, just feeling the pain. You know, if I don't find a baby, I'll just go out and find little puppies in the neighborhood and feed them. So here's this great teacher, this person in, you know, highest respect, is walking literally down the pulpit, walking to you and say, you're like my little puppy. I want to feed you and be close to me. And then sometimes he turns himself into an animal. He says, you know, sometimes when I'm talking, somebody in that corner falls asleep. don't think anything bad about it. That's because my voice comes from a place of safety. And people feel so safe that feel okay to fall asleep. And then he says, you know, like what? Like you're riding in a caravan in a dark desert, you're afraid of highway people and, you know, thieves and all that, and then you suddenly hear a dog barking, or, you know, a rooster, a crow, and you know that you're near a village. I am that dog of the village that is telling you a place of safety is within your reach. So I think that with all of the kind of, unfortunately, unsafe environments around us, and I don't mean just, you know, guns or actual murders, but the way we have to prove ourselves, the way we have to excel in everything, the way we have to use our time efficiently. And believe me, I do all of those things, so I don't think I'm a saint, you know. But the pressure is so destructive. It could be, feeling safe is not easy. And so in what he gives us in his work is that place of safety. And he wants to tell us that you can create that too, and you can reside in this place that I'm giving you and expand it and make it your own, and do it the way you find appropriate, the use of this space. And there's a quote that, that I want to definitely leave with you because it's one of my favorite quotes, a couple of quotes, actually short quotes I want to leave with you. And that's, again, as he's talking to people, he says, Tan hamchun Maryam ast va har yeki Isa darim. Our bodies are like a Mary, and we each have a Jesus inside. Agar ma ra dard peyda shavad Isای ma bezayad. If we feel the pain, but the word for pain and longing are the same in Persian, but if we go through the pain of labor and the longing for our child, we can give birth to our Jesus. If not, he will just go back to the divine origin where he came from, and we will remain deprived. And so all of these different pressures, in his opinion, silence the sacred voice inside us. And listening to him, listening to each other, being able to create spaces for each other allows us also to let our own inner voice to come to the surface and speak. Also, he gives some very, very easy and accessible metaphors that I think also make him very popular with readers, because, you know, you think about God, we're told God is everywhere, you cannot see him or her, and you cannot describe, and then he comes up with this metaphor, Haq Ta'ala aftab ast bar hamegان mitabad. God is sunlight, like the sunlight. It's everywhere. It shines on you. And bari jam sabaktar kon ta zoq aftab bebini. All you need to do is to wear fewer layers so that you can feel the warmth of the sun. Now, he's talking about giving in that particular instance when he says this. So by layers, he means everything that belongs to us and kind of cover us, like, you know, things we don't want to lose, our youth, the money we have earned, the popularity, whatever it is that's important to us. And he's saying these are layers that cover you and prevent you from getting sunlight. So I think that is why a poet who lives in the 13th century, and we could go on talking about all these different points. And if you're interested in following such conversations, I have a podcast called Radio Rumi, and there are some bookmarks out there that you could find the address to them. They're free and open for everybody to use if you're interested. And that's what I do there. I try to reach out to people with these messages that, because of the difference in language, we don't necessarily always have access to. So I try speaking English there, try to reach out to people, but give them some of these gems that hopefully would make a difference to their learning, to their lives, and as he always wants, he says whenever he finishes a poem, almost always, he says, I did my job, finished, it's your turn. Take my poem and make it your own and write it again. And if you think about it, all good poets do that. That's why they last forever, from century to century, because readers can make them their own and take them forward. So thank you so much for that, for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions or comments you have. Thank you. Yes.
Hello. I've got the microphone. If somebody wants to ask a question, raise your hand. I will come to you.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Andrea. I study Persian and Literature up at UT. I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say it was wonderful and illuminating.
Thank you.
I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit more about the translations of Rumi that we see in the US and Western countries. I know you mentioned Coleman Barks, and I understand there's a lot of pros and cons to his translations on Rumi. So based on your knowledge and extensive scholarship, what would you envision for a future where we can honor Rumi's heritage fully and his contributions to Persian literature, while also making it accessible?
Okay, so in terms of actual sources, let me send them in an email to Professor Hadzi-Antich to share with you. I have a little bibliography of translations. If that's okay with you all, I'm assuming that there is a place where you could share this. But let me say a few things. You know, as I said, the English-speaking parts of the world were, in fact, almost discovered him last. And there are some translations of Rumi that were done in early 20th century, and they're very archaic. They're actually very loyal to, try very hard to be very loyal to the original, like Reynold Nicholson is one who has translated the Masnavi, but it's full of Latin. Rumi is very frank about talking about body, about sex, about everything, and then Nicholson is not, so he puts all that in Latin. So, you know, you're reading this and you get to this Latin, you know, and it's hard to follow. But he did that specifically for scholars of his time. And I think that, you know, and that was the tradition of his time. There's another professor in Cambridge, A.J. Arbery. He does more of the lyric poetry. I think he's a degree closer to our present day language of poetry, but there's still a lot that these translators are worried about. They don't want to let everything come out. Where he's too daring, they're afraid of showing it because of the traditions they come from. And later on, when you get to closer to 80s and 70s, 80s, and 90s, people like Coleman Barks, they totally do away with anything that has anything to do with religion, because, you know, I actually was present when one of the great scholars of religion, Houston Smith, was giving a talk, a very learned and wonderful talk, but he made a comment that really shocked me. He said, "Thank God for Sufis like Rumi, because otherwise we could never talk to Muslims." And I thought, what? Rumi is really dipped in Islam, you know. You shake him and Quran falls from every verse he's written. The issue is he's not imprisoned in it. He feels free to quote it and even say, oh, your understanding of this is not right. This is how I understand it. But, you know, he's it's almost impossible to read either a piece of lyric poetry or any of his speculative mystical conversations without finding all kinds of references to sayings of the Prophet, to the Quran itself. But then he's very frank. He says, do you want the outer surface? You want to be a literalist? Or do you want to get the inner core of meaning? He says, you know, we eat watermelon, we eat the inside, we get the cover to our donkeys. You know, and he doesn't mean it as an insult. He means there are beings like donkeys who are happy with the skin of watermelon, and there are other beings who want the inner. So there are all kinds of levels of understanding there. So that's one of the problems that the later translations face. I would not totally rule out Coleman Barks because he's a poet. He writes in a very playful language. Unfortunately, his problem is he doesn't know any Persian. So he gets, yes, and you know, this was a time-honored Orientalist. Europeans who studied the Orient, Orientalists did that. You know, Fitzgerald didn't know Persian, but he translated Omar Khayyam, and he became one of the best translators. But at least he said, somebody else has done it for me, and I was inspired by it, and this is in my language. But when you read Coleman Barks, you think that this is for word-for-word translation, which, I mean, you can never do for word-for-word, but I mean a loyal translation to the origin, it is not. And let me say one more thing. I don't really mean that translators should stick that closely to everything that the poet does in the original. That's impossible. You know, you have to take it in, again, make it your own, and then write it in your own language. And sometimes people say, does a lot get lost in that translation? Yeah, some does, but some things are also found. So translation is a lost and found place. You get inspired and you say it in your own way, and you know, and then lastly, I think people like Rumi and Dante and you know, Hafiz and Shakespeare and others, they need multiple translators and new translators coming every few decades. Let me just tell you, there is a good translation of the Masnavi by a young, relatively young Afghan scholar at Rutgers, Javed Mojaddedi, and I'll send all of that to Professor Hadzi-Antich to share with you. There's one here, I think. Oh, well, there is one here, but if you, I don't.
So if you think about translations, so I've done translation between Dutch and English, and there are literally things that I had to have discussions and say, if you say this directly, it actually completely changes the meaning.
Yeah.
So direct translations are often impossible.
Right, right. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you think about Rumi and translation, are there certain things that are very difficult or almost impossible to translate into English? And can you think of examples where, just of the kind of artistry that's required to actually try and convey something? Because so often it's really impossible to convey exactly the same thing. So it's almost writing a poem again.
Right. Well, you know, if you, first of all, tomorrow I'm going to talk about how to read Rumi, basically. So if I don't know if you're able to come and interested, but I will address translation a little more in depth. Yeah, the same thing can never be said. But there are always cultural, let me put it this way. We think of translation in dictionary terms. If you think that way, your main goal would be creating equivalency. But that doesn't work for translation. Translation, the first thing, I used to teach translation, the first thing you have to get everyone to think about is that it's not about equivalence. You're not going to say, okay, the verb is here and the subject here and the object is here. So once you put that out of the way, you need to be able to know the context, know the history, of course, to understand the language very well, but then you just make it your own. Take and use an expression in your own language, which in your understanding corresponds to the one that the author is using in his or her writing. And I think it is to some extent close to impossible, but that's the attraction of it. You know, I remember I was talking to a professor of English I had in Iran who had translated Shakespeare very well, because there were other translators as well. And I said, how did you think about translating Shakespeare? And he said, you know, I was like strolling, and then suddenly came upon this towering mountain, and I thought, I can't go up there, can I? But then I thought, if I don't try, I will never know. So that's how I started doing it. So I think that impossibility or near impossibility is very attractive.
So I bet you get this question a lot, but Rumi has become a meme, you know, kind of all over the internet. There's little phrases that get shared. And I was thinking about that in terms of what you were saying about him being a poet for our time and making it your own. And so I was wondering, you know, obviously some things are lost when you take things out of the context of the poem and out of the cultural context. But what do you think about that, like these little thought forms of Rumi sort of floating around the internet and people seeing them in their daily lives?
Right. You know, unfortunately, this happens to people who become very attractive through their artwork, that, you know, we just take pieces out of context. I don't think very highly of that. I think that unfortunately could be totally out of context, that it could be presenting him as if he agrees or disagrees with something, that if you put it in the chain of verses where he's talking about, you know, some things are generalizable, others are not. And the only way you could make that judgment is if you know the corpus of his work, pretty, you know, comfortable with it, so that you can see if this could be something that's not in total conflict with Rumi's approach to things. So I would say that, you know, if somebody wanted to reproduce a work of art like a painting, you can't give the brush to a person who is painting for the first time. There could be people who do it in the end, but after they have learned the tradition and various skills and ways of doing things, which in this case means not only knowing Rumi a little bit, but knowing the Persian literary tradition of the time, some of the political and social realities of his life, some of the biographical information about him and all that. So making it your own, I think, with a kind of in-depth dedication to understand could work. Now, you might say, well, are you telling me I have to become a scholar of Rumi in order to do that? I don't think I'm going that deep, but what I'm saying is, for example, translations could be compared. Or if we're really dedicated and interested, read a book on the biography of the poet and see what kinds of things are likely or are not likely. So without the expectation that we become an in-depth scholar of that literature, we can do that. Now, the other thing is, what are we doing it for? If you're teaching a course on Rumi, of course you have to go much more in depth. if you are borrowing a poem, I mean, people write to me all the time because they want, and this includes Persian speakers and English speakers of all backgrounds. I get probably roughly at least one a week when they want a poem by Rumi to read in a wedding. Their son is getting married, their daughter is getting married, their father has passed away, something that, you know, and it's hard to do because I take something out for them. I actually almost have a folder on that. But then I have to tell them, look, don't take this for, you know, they just do a paragraph about it. If you want to give any further explanation, feel free to write to me. Look at this book if you have a question. So that's not as in-depth as teaching a course, but people might come to you after you've read that, and it's good to know for yourself too a little bit. And then there are things that are totally universal, like, you know, come, the spring has arrived, and yeah, you have to come out and see the beauty around. You know, you can't, if you wanted to interpret that a few layers deeper into what he means by that spring, then yes, you get into the specialized area. But I think he does have all of these categories. He does have poems that are generalizable and universal, and those that are specifically rooted in the context and cannot be interpreted in any other way. But that you're making a very important point, and a point that requires a separate, probably, you know, exploration, because it is important.
In sort of the same vein of translation, I'm curious about, like, most texts we have from like 12th or 13th century, there's a scribal tradition to keep that text alive, I'm assuming.
Can you get it closer?
Oh, sorry. There's must have been some sort of scribal tradition to keep that text alive, or Rumi's body of work alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about if there are, what that looks like to study Rumi and be like, is this line really his, or is this a scribal error, or something like that?
Right. That's an excellent question, because actually Rumi is among the people who gained the fame and the significance in his own lifetime. So things were written in his lifetime. In fact, sometime when I was in graduate school, a new copy of the Masnavi was found in Konya, where on the margin, and of course you can test the paper and the ink and all that, it said that this Masnavi has been read back to him. Now, of course, you know, it's not like you can have 27,000 lines, you know, by heart, and you say, oh, this and wasn't there. But at least he could testify to the sense of authenticity that he had for it. There are tons and tons of writings of his lyric poetry, of the Masnavi, just through the ages, because there was a lot of demand for it. And manuscripts have this colophon, if you're, you know, familiar with that, at the very end, when the scribe says about, you know, at what time, where, and how this copy was produced. So by looking at the paper, by looking at ink, by looking at the style, by reading the colophon, the end of the manuscript, you can tell if what you have in your hand is something that is relatively close to what we can call authentic. Now, people also started commenting on his writing. There are so many, there are 10-volume commentaries on the Masnavi itself. And so they also discuss that so-and-so's version has a few non-authentic verses. I disagree with that. and then somebody else comments on that. So around the figure of Rumi and his writing, a whole tradition has developed, which is highly textual and preserved in actual ink and paper. Now, in addition to that, of course, there is an oral tradition because you sing it to music. In fact, there are special styles of singing created specifically for the Masnavi. I wish I had a good singing voice and I could show you one. I'm afraid I don't. But you know, if you look up, if you're interested and you're interested in music in particular, you can type Masnavi singing into YouTube, and you'll get people singing it. And some may sing it better than others. But so there is also that oral tradition. Then later on, people, as the collection of the manuscripts grow, then creating what we call a critical edition between them becomes another issue. So it is a complex and interesting tradition, and you know what is best about it? People use this poetry as a podium to speak their own mind. As they were writing about him, commentary, they were actually expressing the way they understood it. And so, you know, and this was in Turkish, in Arabic, in Persian, and later on, of course, in Western languages. So, yes, we do have some ideas of parts that are not authentic, but it's not possible to fully separate the authentic and inauthentic or unauthentic or whatever it is. Yes, I think there was a question there.
Thank you. So the theme of our third unit for Great Questions is verse and revelation, and so those things sort of seem to go together a lot. And you said that Rumi was giving new expression to certain ideas, certain religious ideas, and I was wondering why Rumi chose poetry, verse, for that purpose.
I think that, well, first of all, that's an excellent question, because I'll tell you why he used it, but that's a question that should come to mind. Why did he write, you know, more than 90% of what he wrote in poetry? But before I get to that, he did his own sermons or exchanges with people when he sat and talked. Those are not in poetry, although they are very poetic. You know, our body is a Mary and we each have a Jesus. That's in that exchange. And, but why he wrote in poetry? I think there are many factors involved. First, he's very prone to enjoying poetic language because of the rhythm, because of the playfulness. He really wants to, he plays with language. He breaks rules of prosody, he adds things, omit things, but he does it in such a way that you don't really see it as an aberration or, you know, wrong with his work. So that's one thing. The other thing is he wants to get others to see this. And the poetic art can do that in the tradition in which he lives. Poetry is very, very valued and powerful. I was telling some friends last night that when people traveled across the Silk Road, you know, from China down to, you know, Central Asia and coming down to various cities along the road to Persian-speaking parts of the world, you know, when you arrived somewhere and you had come from some parts of Iran, people would say, you know, usually they would say, do you have any precious stones? Do you have pepper and other spices? Do you have silk from India? But they would also say, do you have any of the poems of Sa'di or Rumi? Because it was really valued. And if you were learned in that, you could get a teaching job there. There are people who moved totally, but because others understood and the echo of poetry meant something to others, they actually were not strangers and they could talk to each other. And lastly, poetry stretches the language. what you need to say in 2-3 paragraphs, you might say in one expression. Again, at lunch, I said that. Rumi says, some point, خود از کف دست من مرغان عجب رویند می از لب من جوشد در مستیان حالت. Wondrous birds grow from the palm of my hands, and wine gushes forth from my mouth. And, you know, it's about his poetry. But wondrous birds, I mean, how else can you say my poetry is alive? My poetry has a life of its own. It can fly, it can sing, it has different you know, shapes and colors and so forth. So poetic language gave him the ability also to express things that were not so easy to express in just prose and non-poetic language, I think.
Maybe another question, and then we'll have our discussion. Anybody? No? Okay. Well, let's give our speaker a warm round of applause, and thank you for an excellent speech.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
What we'll do now is we'll create a circle, and we'll talk, and that's the goal. And eat some food, please.